Hey guys, my name's Andrea. I am one of the co-executive directors of HackPSU. I hope you guys are enjoying our summer workshops. Today we get to work with all of these different topics, and you may be wondering how they all fit together. The answer is each and every one of them has a public API. Welcome to the Intro to APIs workshop. This is a beginner to intermediate level workshop, so if at any time you feel like we're moving too slow, go ahead and skip ahead in the video. After I briefly explain what an API is, we'll get right into example API calls because I think that's the best way to learn APIs. These are the APIs that you can look forward to learning about more in Postman, a tool that I'll introduce later. Then I will show you the programmatic approach to consuming APIs. In this tutorial, we will primarily be using Python as I believe it is the most accessible. However, each API has alternative examples if you are more comfortable in other languages. The Spotify example uses NodeJS and JavaScript, but you do not have to have experience in either. For these examples, unless you are someone who loves working in terminal, you will definitely want an IDE. I will be using Visual Studio Code with the Python extension, but feel free to use any code editor you are accustomed to. Also note, we will only be going into calling existing APIs, we won't be building any. So without further ado, what is an API? API stands for Application Programming Interface. APIs allow applications to talk to each other, meaning you can access data and build upon functionalities of other applications, which can be really useful to incorporate into your own projects. You can send an API request to retrieve or send data to an API endpoint and receive a response back. The API is responsible for delivering the request and the response between you and the system you're calling. It essentially dictates how you talk to one another, like the middleman in a family argument. So some of the advantages include efficiency, as you'll see in some of our examples. There are also a lot of opportunities to automate processes using APIs, and debatably the biggest benefit is being able to integrate data and new and cool functionality into your application that you may not have been equipped for space-wise or experience-wise. Of course, there are a few disadvantages. Naturally, by adding an external layer of communication, it does often present some security risks, particularly if you are sending sensitive data. And for this reason, along with many others, it may require maintenance and support, so definitely worth thinking about the costs beforehand. So the last thing I wanted to mention before we get into the examples are the common HTTP methods, which are fairly consistent across all API requests. These include GET, which implies receiving data, POST, which often means sending new data, creating new records and objects, PUT, which is often editing or updating existing data, and delete, as you would think, is removing existing data. And with that, I think it's a good time to move on to Postman. So one tool we'll be using today is Postman. As you can see, it is great for building APIs. We'll actually be using it for testing. And we'll be using the API client, which allows you to send REST, SOAP, and GraphQL requests. Here on this page, you can go ahead and download the app if you want to take a minute and do that. So just to show you around a little, if you hit New, you can create a new request this way. You can also save your requests in a collection. And lastly, you can create an environment if you find yourself frequently reusing values across multiple requests. So as you can see over here, I created a collection for this workshop, and up here you can set your environment. Another way to create a new request is by clicking this plus button. It automatically defaults to a GET request, but this is where you would select your method as we talked about before. We'll introduce the request URL field as well as the parameter fields in our examples. As for authorization, we won't really be talking too much about that today. There are a lot of different authorization methods. You'll see a few in practice in our programmatic examples. This is also something that you'll find detailed in any API documentation, so don't stress about that for now. If your request asks to add headers, this is where you would do that. We already have some hidden headers over here. This is where you can kind of search for a lot of other really popular headers. So one that I know is used often is content type. So they're pretty easy to find and you'll know when you need them. Same with the body. This is where you would send any body text that the request requires. So yeah, that is pretty much it, except for send. Of course, this is how you will actually send your requests. Finally, let's get into the examples. Today we'll be getting all of our APIs from apilist.fun, which is just a list of fun APIs. We have the meme generator, and just a lot of cool options. You can actually sort by upvotes, see which ones are kind of the most popular on this page. Pretty interesting ones. And you can also search, so if we go and search Google, Google has a ton of APIs, enough to do an entire video on. Today we'll be looking at one of those. And another thing is they also split them up by categories, so if you're interested in any of these categories, say like crime, they have an API for that. Another one you might find interesting is the machine learning category. I actually got to work with the IBM Watson API during my first internship, and there's just a lot of really cool options for you. So we're just gonna start with a pretty funny one called HTTP cat, and you can use this link to go to the API docs. And pretty much what this is there are cat pictures for all kinds of different HTTP response codes, and there are real response codes. I kind of feel like I have to show you this one just to prove that there is a picture of a cat. Yeah, they're just pretty funny. Another one that I found pretty funny was unauthorized. So we're going to be using this for our first Postman request. What we're going to need is the base URL and the path, which is the status code in this case. So I've copy pasted this URL into Postman. It's going to be a GET request because we are getting information, and I've also replaced the status code with 100, which is the picture that we'll want to get. And if we send that, it shows up right in Postman. One thing to note is that we did include the base URL and the path parameter all in the URL field, which is totally fine. Another way you can do it is by adding a parameter which follows the convention a /:, and the name of the parameter. In this case, we'll call it status code. And as you can see, Postman pre-populates this key below, so we just have to add a value. We'll just go with 402. And there you go. It matches up. So there are a couple different ways to do it. So next we'll be doing a little more useful one. This is actually one that Postman offers, and it's just regarding the coronavirus statistics. So we can just, again, copy this URL right into Postman, and it does specify that this is a GET method. So I went ahead and updated the Postman with the GET and the URL. So if we send that, this one's actually a little bit interesting. It actually returns a JSON file of all the different endpoints that you can call with this, and it gives you the path, and a lot of them are in the format that we just went over. So if we go try this one, it gets the list of cases per country by case type from the first record case. Pretty interesting. Copy paste that right into the URL field and populate the value of country to United States. So we receive back a JSON where each entry has a date field and also the amount of active cases. So January 29th was our first active case in the US. If we scroll down a little bit, say like about a month, we have February 29th, we have 60 active cases now and our first death. And now if we keep on scrolling and scrolling to the very bottom, we'll get to the date that I'm actually filming this part of the video, June 29th, and obviously the numbers have grown, sadly, by a huge amount. So back to API-list.fun, we're going to check out the Star Wars API. Here we have right on the front page the URL that we'll be using. This one you don't need an API key for any public calls, so we're going to go ahead and check out the Yoda API. So if we scroll down to the information about the actual endpoint, we see that it actually does say post, but in Postman it works as a get, just something to be mindful of. And in this case, we will need to pass a query parameter, which works a little bit different, but we can just start by copy-pasting this URL into Postman. So we start out the same. As I mentioned, we're going to use a get call rather than a post. But this time we're actually going to want to pass in a query parameter. And if you go back to the documentation, the name of the parameter is text. You'll want to match that. And as you can see, it will append this to the URL. In this case, the naming convention will be a question mark and then an equal sign. And as we give it a value, HackPSU is my favorite hackathon, it will also self-populate up at the top. And so we get back the response. It says the translation is my favorite hackathon, HackPSU is. Sounds about right. And if you want to add another query parameter, you can go ahead and do that. The naming convention does change a bit. Instead of a question mark, this one will have an ampersand. But that's really all there is to it. So again, from API-list.fun, we have another API called GeoInfo. We go to the API docs, and we can see this API turns coordinates into human readable locations, which are like cities. We have the URL right there. And this one also gives examples for different coding languages. So we're actually going to do both the Postman and programmatic approach. What we'll need first is, of course, the URL. And also from the code, we can see that this is a get call. So we've copy pasted in the URL, changed it to a get call, and right away we get all this information. So this here is the closest city to the latitude and longitude that we gave it. This is where Postman really comes in handy because although it is a lot of data, it's really easy to sort through just because it comes out in this nice formatted JSON file. So now I've copy pasted the Python code into a Python file called Geocode API in Visual Studio Code. I've also set up a folder with all the different API endpoints we'll be using today. So we import requests, which is a Python library that makes HTTP calls really simple. We have our same URL as before, and it is a GET request, as I mentioned. And from that JSON response we got earlier, we just want the city. So if we run that, as you'll see, it matches up to what we got in the JSON file. Of course, you can get the entire JSON file, but I'm going to show you just how much harder it is to look at in this way. So now that we've taken a look at the programmatic approach to accessing endpoints, we're going to take a look at the Twilio API, which is going to allow us to send messages. First, you will need an account, so go ahead and sign up. You can start an account for free, go through the process of setting up your account, or you can also just log in if you have an account. So the first thing you'll need to do is get a trial number. This is a number that will send the messages, and it'll just be associated with your Twilio account. You can search for a different number. I'm just going to go with this one for the purpose of this workshop, and that'll be your new number. So definitely take note of the location of your number as it appears right there. We'll also come back to this page for some more info later. So first we're just going to go ahead and access the API docs for Twilio. You might want to open it in a new tab. As I mentioned, we will be wanting to come back. So they have the Twilio REST API, get some data about your account, or the one that's probably their most popular is the messaging API. And this is a really easy walkthrough of sending your first message. This first link will take you straight to the steps, so go ahead and click on that. On the right, you'll notice that there is a console with Python code that we'll be using in this tutorial, but you can also use any of the languages that you'd like. First, you're going to want to set up the helper libraries though. So we're going to go ahead and click this link, which will take us to another example of the code. We can copy right from there. And also these commands which will allow you to install the Twilio libraries. So you can go ahead and copy paste this right into your terminal. Keep in mind, I had to use pip3, that's just what I have, so if it doesn't work, maybe try that. Once you've done that, you can scroll back up and copy paste this right into your editor. So this is where you're going to need your own account data. The Twilio UI does self-populate with your account SID if you are logged in, but you're definitely going to need to go back and get your auth token. This is what's going to authorize you to send a message from your account. So back in your Twilio account, this is where you'll be able to copy your account SID if you still need it, and also your auth token. And don't forget to grab your Twilio trial number because you will also need that to send the message. So once you have copy pasted those into their respective locations, you can go ahead and customize what you want your message to say. We're going to say join us at HackPSU Fall 2020. Also, this from is going to be where you want your Twilio number. To will be where you will put in your cell phone number. Obviously, I can't give you guys my cell phone number or my auth token, so I'm going to go ahead and fill those out, but once you're ready, you can press run. The terminal will print out the message SID as it says in the code, and you'll receive a nice message from your Twilio trial account. Now we're going to check out the Google Cloud Natural Language Processing API. Here we are at the documentation. We're going to want to get started, set up our account first. Of course, it is free. We do get $300 credit for 12 months, and although you will have to set up billing, it will not automatically charge you unless you upgrade your account. So once you go through those steps, you'll land on your account. We're actually just going to want to go back to the documentation and get started. So first, we're just going to go to Quick Start. This is really simple. You can set up your natural language. We're just going to go right to Quick Start using client libraries. So next we're going to want to set up a project. You are going to want to select a project to enable Cloud Natural Language API. If you haven't already, you have to configure your billing account first, but then you can come back and enable your API. This is super important. You definitely need to download this private key as JSON. This is going to authenticate your service account, and put this somewhere safe, somewhere you can access it. You'll need it for the next step, which is setting your environment credentials to the path of the JSON private key file. So make sure you know that location. You're going to need to run this command in your terminal or shell every time you start a new session. So go ahead and copy paste that. Remember to replace path with your specific location of your file. And I can show you this when we go ahead and run the code. But definitely take a minute to quick install the Google Cloud Language library, whether that's through Java or NodeJS. I'm just going to run this pip install command as we did earlier with the Twilio command. I did pip3, that works for you. And finally get down to this example code. So this particular example is going to send in some text to the API and receive back a sentiment analysis. And you'll be able to see that. I'll kind of explain that when we run it. So I've copy pasted this into a new file, haven't changed a thing. It is in the same location as my JSON file. So remember to run that export command to set up our credentials before we go ahead and run the program. Right away we get back this response that says, okay, this is the text I'm analyzing, hello world. And then we also get back two numbers, which are sentiment score and sentiment magnitude. Kind of weird numbers, not really sure what they mean. So I went back to reference the documentation. This page is natural language basics. Definitely recommend if you want to use this API, just to get to know all of the different things that it encompasses. So here we are at sentiment analysis, and this is where you'll find that the score is actually between -1 and +1 and it just kind of describes, is this message negative or is it positive? Magnitude actually describes the strength of the emotion, which can fall between 0 and infinity, 0 being more of indifference or just a general statement, whereas infinity would obviously show more of excitement, hatred, happiness, things like that. And definitely keep in mind that it does state that longer text blocks may have greater magnitude just because this factor is not normalized. So now that we understand, we can demonstrate how changing the text will change these values that we get. So we're just going to say HackPSU is the best hackathon ever. So pretty positive, maybe even a little bit more positive than Hello World. And as we see, yeah, it is. It's even a little bit more stronger, maybe because of the length though. Now we're going to say something much more negative. I hate HackPSU. Hopefully you don't feel this way. But yeah, as you can see, it's the totally different end of the spectrum, very negative, which is exactly what we would expect. So last but not least, we're gonna try out the Spotify Web API. I find this one pretty fun, mainly because I just love music, and I'm hopefully gonna use this on my next project. So let's go ahead and get started. So first you'll come right to this informational page. Definitely interesting to walk through if you want to learn more about this API specifically. We have some of the method explanations which we learned earlier, and the URIs and IDs, all this information, even response status codes for this particular API. So feel free to go through that if you'd like. We're just going to go ahead and go right to the quick start. It's not as quick of a start as the others that we've been working on, mainly because we actually have to set up an application. Spotify does make it pretty easy for you, though, if you just follow these steps. The reason we have to do this is because we are going to need to access user-related data, and to do that we are going to need to set up an authorization portal. So we're going to need to go through these steps. They're going to help you set up a NodeJS and JavaScript application, register it with Spotify, authenticate the user, and then we'll be able to access the web API. First, you're going to need a Spotify account if you don't already have one. You can set one up for free and go through your developer access that way. This will have you register your application before you create it. Don't be worried about that. It will take you through all the steps of preparing your environment, installing these folders and files that they've created. And if you just follow these steps, it's really very straightforward. I'm not going to be able to go through them with you, so don't want to take up too much time. But one thing I do want to explain is where to find the client IDs, secret redirect URI, so I'll show you that. And also take note of these scopes because we'll be referencing that later. So this is the dashboard where you will set up your app. I've already set up my HackPSU test app, so we'll go in. This is where you will find your client ID and your client secret. In addition, you will need a redirect URI. This is where you can add yours. I've just used the one from the example. I think that's the easiest way to go. So go ahead and complete these steps. It does kind of explain the important parts of the project, so take a minute to understand that. Go ahead and run the application. Make sure that you can log in with your Spotify account. And once you get to this last step, that's where we'll continue on with the video. Now I'm just going to run the app. Want to make sure that you're in the correct directory where the app.js file is, and you can run the command. As hopefully you've tried, it's listening on port 8088, and you can just go there on your local host. I've already logged in, so it's going to take me directly to the redirect URI, but normally it would go through an authorization process that you would fill out your password and allow the app to access your account. You'll notice that the console has actually logged some information, and if you go back to look at the code, it is actually the response body from the API call. Now we can actually start to look at some of the other API endpoints that Spotify offers. You can get some information on albums, artists, playlists, and we're actually going to use the player endpoint because I thought it was pretty fun. You can get the user's currently playing track, pause the user's track. We're actually going to make it skip to the next track on an active user's device. And now that we've actually set up the app, a lot of the things fall back to what we've already learned. We have a post method, and this is the path. We already have the URL in the code. And another thing that I pointed out earlier is the scope. So this is another thing we'll have to add to the code. Right here it lists that we have access for user read private, user read email, but we're going to want to add this user modify playback state so that we're able to control what the user is listening to. And another thing we will want to change in the callback redirect URI is the actual URL. So we'll just add the path right there to the URL. And another thing is, this previously was a get call, but we are actually doing a post call now. So we'll want to change that. But those are 3 simple changes that we had to make to change the functionality completely. So now we just want to run the app exactly as we did before, but this time we'll want to play some music so that we can skip the track.